In this video, we're going to draw some fantasy heads with the Loomis method. Now, I've done some of this stuff before, and if you're a fan of the channel or you've seen me do videos before, you know that I'm a fan of Andrew Loomis's figure drawing for all it's worth and drawing the head and hands. I often use these ideas and techniques and the concepts of constructive anatomy in my day-to-day work as a professional concept artist and comic book artist. Now, I often incorporate these ideas into the demos that I do on this channel, but in this video, I really want to go deep and maybe make this part of a series where we really unpack how these ideas of the Loomis method or constructive anatomy in general can help us draw different types of faces. And I'm going to use fantasy characters as a good example of that because, again, I think the typical tropes of fantasy, such as orcs or elves or dwarves, really kind of distort the face, and I think it's a good frame and a good way for us to learn how to draw faces and just how to draw in general. Specifically in this video, I'm going to draw my Ara character, who has a lot of the elven features. We're going to look at how to construct and position ears, how to construct and position horns, and just how to modify and change the character's features to make sure that they fit a particular character type. Anyway, this should be a fun one, so let's jump in and get started. Alright, welcome to the Drawing Codex. My name's Mcburnie. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this channel, we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. Now, today we're dealing with head construction, and I actually have a free workshop that deals with the top 5 mistakes that people normally make when they're constructing heads, when they're thinking about ideas such as the Loomis method. This is a free workshop. It's about an hour, and it just goes over the top 5 mistakes that I've found students make when they're just constructing heads. This is often to do with symmetry, and I really sort of talk about a lot of little tips in there for how you can construct the face, and it should be a good addition to the video that we're going to do today. Anyway, it's free. The link will be in the description. Go check it out. Okay, so there's not much else to say here. This demo should be fun. It's going to combine 2 of my favorite things, drawing fantasy characters and constructive anatomy and the Loomis method. So let's jump over to the drawing table. Alright, here we are at the drawing table. Tools for today are going to be some Blackwing matte pencils. These are the dark ones. I have a 2-stage sharpener to get them a little bit longer and thinner. I'm going to use some kneadable putty eraser to do the erasing. And I've got these books that we can sort of look at for reference. The paper that I'm drawing on is some Strathmore 400 series drawing paper. This is the medium surface, so a little bit sort of textury, very, similar to kind of just standard kind of cartridge art paper, but pretty high quality. It'll kind of let me erase and hack things around if I need. So the task and what we're going to try and do is sort of draw this character's face. Now, in order to do this, there's probably a few small challenges that we have to deal with. Firstly, the fact that her face she has like a little bit of a soft, kind of round baby face to a certain degree. Her chin is kind of a little bit smaller, and it tends to sort of be a little bit receded. So, we kind of have this, right, this kind of like small pointy chin, and, these things affect the look of the character quite a bit. Now, again, we also have to deal with the horns, the way the horns are placed. We have to think about the ears, and obviously the character has, a few other features that are sort of interesting. The lips are kind of fairly close to the nose, and we have an eye patch. A couple of other little things that we'll sort of deal with. If we look at drawing the head and hands, this is the book that typically contains the facial construction methodology that people label as the Loomis method. Now, I have a video that, has got quite a few views here on the channel talking about the truth behind the Loomis method. And really what I'm sort of saying there is that this is certainly a good way to think about breaking down the face, but that really all Loomis is doing is giving you some really cool tips for how he has found himself to be able to break down the face and how he kind of thinks about it. The principles that are underlying this theory are really part of the greater constructive anatomy sort of tradition. And my essential thesis in that video is that Loomis method, Riley method, Bridgman, all of these kind of anatomy books have far more in common than they do to separate them. The other thing that I think is really key to understand about the Loomis method is, look, there's not really any big sort of Loomis method that you need to follow. This, again, is just a matter of understanding the principles of constructive anatomy. Loomis is a real thing, his gift to us, is just the way that he's sort of sequenced it, because he seems to be the kind of person who's thought about this, right? And the way that he's broken it down into the sequence that you are going to be able to easily, define the directionality of the face and then find proportion is actually a really, really good solution. But what you'll find is that even though a lot of these technical things talk about drawing very, very standard kind of boring people, the real thing that it'll help you with is firstly being able to move and rotate the head. So drawing from these basic fundamentals will allow you a little bit easier to track proportion in 3 dimensions. What doesn't get talked about as much is how Loomis shows, even in his own books, how we can use the same basic concept to modify the proportions and get a huge variety of characters. And I think this is really what I want to sort of delve into, is not just look, how do you use the basic, how do you draw the basic human Loomis head, but how do you actually modify those proportions and create actual interesting characters? And Loomis has outlined this as a major sort of part of his system. So it's important to understand that, again, it's not just about very, very static drawing. It's not just about this kind of really technical way of drawing. This is just a good way of explaining the fundamental principles underlying constructive anatomy. The way that we use it can be a little bit more sketchy, a little bit looser. Basically, you can use it however you want to make sure that your drawings look more solid, that you can track them in 3 dimensions a little bit better, and also that you can repeatedly draw characters with different facial features. Alright, so what we'll start with is just try and draw one of these faces big, because this allows us to see it a little bit better. And what I'm going to do is describe how we would try and construct this face. Now, the first principle of the Loomis method is to kind of find the directionality of the face. Often what we're trying to get to is the center line and the way that other lines are essentially going to line up with and relate to that center line of the face. And the point that we're often trying to get to is this point right between the eyes. So what Loomis is trying to get us to do is to find dimensionality within a sphere, because this is a really good way of positioning the face. And that's really all the point is here. What we're trying to do is discover this frontal plane of the face to a certain degree and understand the dimensionality that goes with just understanding, like where is this face pointing, right? As this face, right, you imagine it has a giant Pinocchio style nose on it, right? As this rotates in space, those things move, right? And the same thing here, if we think about the head being tilted as it tilts, right? The frontal plane tilts as well. Really simple. That's mostly what we're trying to get here. That's mostly what we're trying to achieve. Now, you can, at this point, really do whatever you want, because that is the major thing that the Loomis method is trying to get you to do, which is define the constructive anatomy position of the center of the forehead, right? Not the forehead, between the eyes. Once you do that, you can then kind of construct whatever proportion set you want off it. Typically, the one that he's talking about is where we use a set of proportions where we take this first proportion, which is from the middle there of the sphere, right between the eyes of our skull, bonk, right there. We take that, and then we sort of find where kind of the hairline would be, which essentially is just an easy way of saying, look, don't go right to the top of the sphere. Let's just go a little bit below. And then we consider that to be one proportion, and then we're going to then duplicate that proportion another 2 times. So we get this kind of 3 sets of equal proportion. And basically what is going to happen there is we can then find a nose, a mouth, we can find the ear, and we can find the neck, however big the neck is. So that's really what we're trying to do. Now, the interesting thing is that up here, if we think about trying to find that, there's no limit to what other marks you can put in or which marks are important for you. Now, the other thing that tends to be important is that he is recommending that we cut off the side of the head, right? So we start to imagine and think about this idea of having a sphere and then chopping off the side of it, right? And he kind of literally draws this as if, right, as if you're taking a knife and you are kind of cutting, right? You're cutting the side of this off. So that's the best way to kind of think about it, right? We're going to have some eyes here, right? A nose here. 1, 2, 3. Right, so that's the general idea there. Now, this gives us a couple of really important points. It sort of starts to give us these sides of the forehead that are really, really important from a structural point of view, because the head does tend to go in around the brow. So again, these probably have some anatomical name, but I'm not really thus inclined to find them. So one of the things I often try and do is try and find these markers early on and really think about where that brow is going to be, and also think about where the cheekbones are going to be. Now, I put these in roughly, but that just allows me to imagine this slope of the skull. And it stops me kind of making mushy faces where I don't put in the cheekbones. But again, that's something that I do because it helps me to define that. It also helps me to define if people have really big cheekbones, right? Like an orc character might have really big cheekbones, so I might want to make the little construction. All right, boom. We're making the same kind of construction. We chop the side off. I've got the center, right? And again, an orc's going to be slightly different proportion-wise. So I've got the center line. I've got these two brow ridges, but, you know, although an orc may have other modifications, one of the things that's really going to help me to find that space is to just think about essentially the mass of these cheekbones there. And then we would have kind of a nose, right? Giant forehead potentially, and then something like this. Again, depending on, this is not necessarily the best orc design, but this is how we would think about it. So defining the size of the cheekbones is a really good sort of anatomical marker for me personally. So that's one of the things that I do. I often try and just visualize, like, how big are these cheekbones? Now, obviously, how long the face is here is a really key aspect of style as well. So one of the things that I tend to do, if you look at some of the work that I'm sort of doing currently, is I tend to make this third proportion a little bit longer, and I make the nose a little bit smaller. So when I'm setting out those proportions in my mind, what I'm doing is thinking about, okay, here's my first proportion, right? Here's my mark between the eyes. Here's this guy up here. But the nose, I'm like, it's actually a little bit less than that. And then the chin is a lot bigger. So I get something a little bit more like this. Boom. Still an ear in there. And again, that's just a stylistic affectation, right? From a comic book point of view, like, why would you want to do that? It typically gives you a little bit more emotional room to move the mouth around, right? On a normal human character, you don't often get heaps of room to move the mouth around there. So anyway, that's something that I've kind of, started to do. Because I just kind of like to look at it. That's sort of developed over time. And again, sometimes I sort of exaggerate that even more. But the key here is that these proportions are essentially up to you. Now, with this character, she doesn't do that. She has a little bit more of a typical set of proportions. I'm just trying to find a place to do the example of her, because this will be key. Right, so this character has the Ara elf character, and I'm not necessarily drawing exactly this character. This is just for a demo. Right, we've got one proportion, two proportions, right, or essentially just one, but two markers, one set of proportion. She then has a nose that's pretty standard, and I actually think that it's worthwhile keeping her proportions pretty normal, right? That's kind of how the character was designed. But what happens is, because she has a slightly softer chin, this point here is going to go in a little bit. So we're going to have a point that is a little bit more like this. And that is just to say that the chin goes in a little bit. And what also tends to happen with this character is that these lips are really quite high up as well. So we get a set of proportions that's a little bit different. It's a little bit different to the classic proportion. And this is how you can combine your concepts of style with, some good solid drawing. Now, I didn't always do it this way, but I found that when I didn't do it this way, I had real trouble keeping things honest when I was drawing comics, and it was a bit harder for me to draw the characters and make them look the same. So that's kind of why I delved into this and really sort of doubled down on it. So there's a couple of things we need to do. Firstly, I can look at the 1, 2, which is giving me that first proportion. Now let's kind of roughly just by eye mirror that down. Then let's roughly mirror that down again. I've got 1, 2, 3. Again, they're not super solid. They're pretty rough there. And what I'm going to try and do is say, like, look, there is going to be a nose here. I'm going to mask that in for my visualization. What I'm going to do is also visualize and try and construct this brow ridge, right, and get that center line. So one of the things we're trying to do here is often define what is happening with that center line. And we're using the center line here to help us with that. So we have the center line that we're drawing in 3 dimensions, and we have the center line that we can visualize in 2 dimensions when we're looking at things from the side. Very, very important distinction. Now, we also have this, which is where, instead of, if we think about and visualize where these lines would be going, if I were to just drop this line down here, it would be somewhere around there. But what I want to do is move it in. And all that means is this line is going to go in a little bit, and that's going to allow me to soften the look of that. So I've got my center line now. I've got my nose, and what I'm also going to consider is, like, this is where the base of the nose is. We know that her lips are a little bit higher. So I'm going to think where I can put the lips and that mound of the mouth a little bit higher up. Now, this looks a little bit constructy, right? It looks a little bit silly. We've got a whole bunch of silly lines everywhere. But these are the things that we either think about or we can consciously put in, depending on how much effort you need to put into this. As you progress along your artistic journey, you get a little bit better at putting in these marks, and you need to do them less. because they can be done in your mind. And that really is the trick of a lot of constructive anatomy. When people start learning perspective, it often seems like, oh man, this is the least arty thing you could possibly ever do. This is completely miserable. The thing is that the more we do this, the more we can start to do it in our own mind and think about these proportional markers without doing all this stuff. But again, this is the sequence that I would go through, trying to find these points. Now, there's a couple of other points I found here. What I'm finding is the jawline. I've got the side of the face, the side of the skull that's going down here, and I've got the jaw. And what I'm doing is thinking about, again, where are these lines that are going this way? Because these are what I'm going to use to line up the nose with the ear. Right, I can wrap lines around the face. Think about the construction. Think about the dimensionality. And what I'm thinking about is where this jaw is. So the jawline comes down. And it's going to change direction pretty close to where the mouth is. So I'm sort of thinking about where the mouth wraps around. That's where my jaw is, and then I'm going to transfer that jaw over to the other side. And what we're doing there essentially is thinking about the jaw. And what I'm trying to visualize is this shape, this horseshoe shape of the bottom of the jaw. Now, if we look at that angle from here, I can see this point here. And what I'm trying to find is this point over here. So I'm kind of imagining this is all transparent. I'm drawing through and I'm finding that point. All right, so I can imagine where the jawline would be. All right, it would probably be somewhere over here, again coming down. And then what I'm sort of drawing is more or less the musculature and fat that is going to sort of cover over the gap that we tend to have there in the skull. Now, it's important to understand when you're looking at facial anatomy, the skull and the muscles are good for finding particular points, particular markers, but it doesn't often tell us what the final thing is going to look like. It can often be a little bit discouraging to learn all this facial anatomy, and then you kind of realize that, yeah, most of the markers, most of the things that you end up drawing are not really part of the skull all the time. So the next thing I'm going to do is think about where are these eyes. Well, I've got the nose, and the way that I tend to draw and think about the nose is almost like this. I'm drawing the place that the nose will kind of be, almost if you cut it off on the face. And what I'm going to do is draw in the nose there and construct it once I have that and find the center of it. Again, I'll modify it a little bit from that, but that's the basic idea. But what I also want to do is think about where these eye sockets are. And not just that, but I like to visualize roughly where the shape of the eye is going to be. So this is semi-eye socket. It's semi, look, how big are the eyes? And this will help me to gauge my proportion from here to here, and also just true up the perspective a little bit. Boom. So there we've got this line. Now, before we continue, let's see if I can think about connecting the spine here. So I'm visualizing the spine coming down here like this, visualizing, right, her kind of almost looking up a little bit. We've got this skull coming back. We've got the neck coming here. Got the center of the neck. We've got something, again, kind of roughly like that. She's got a fairly long neck here. If I was to put in the anatomy, right, we'd be looking at some of this stuff here. Again, the character has costume details that I'm not going to put in too much because they will interfere with all these other drawings that I've done, but that's the basic idea. Now, what we also have to do is kind of imagine what's happening with the ears. And again, you know, a basic thing we need to think about is just how we line up the ears or the horns, right? So if we think about just putting horns on our character, what we're looking for are the lines that will define the dimensionality of where those are. So I'm always looking for where lines already exist on the face, on the skull, and how that might change and allow me to line up things like horns or whatever, or ears, right? So same thing for ears. If we put ears on here, what I'm kind of looking for is where do those ears line up if I were to draw imaginary lines along them. So we can think about with the ear, although in this case I think we're not going to be able to draw all of it. We're sort of running out of space. I already have some of these lines going across, and this is why I sort of say in the beginning, what we're trying to think about and visualize is this dimensionality. Now, what you could do is really try and construct behind and draw through and think about, or at least visualize where this is going. Now, what I often end up doing is probably cheating a little bit when it comes to elf ears, because it's very specific, the shapes that they would make, and I think probably a lot of drawing of elf ears is a little bit fudged to make sure that the shapes look good. The key here is to try and visualize and make sure, I think, that we don't make any really silly mistakes, and that is that, look, we should try and make the tips of these things line up as much as possible. So there I'm like, oh, I'm not really sure we were doing that. Tip of the ear is going to be somewhere over here. If we draw across there, this is really what I think we should be trying to get happening. All right, just make sure that this tip here and this tip here line up. Similar with the horns here. So I've got horns, and I'm sort of thinking about and trying to visualize, like, where do these horns connect to the head? So they're kind of on the side here, a little bit above, right? A little bit above the eyebrow, a little bit above where the ear is there. And what I'm going to do for this construction is really think about some very, very simple shapes. I've got the circle that is connecting to the head, and then I kind of have a cylinder which is coming up, and then I sort of have a spherical object, and then I have the rest of the horn that kind of comes off, and that's how I sort of tend to try and mass it out. So I think about where it connects. Let's see if I can transfer that basic idea over here. It really sort of seems to me that I'm not going to be able to see much of where this horn connects on this side over here, but I will see the cylinder that comes off. So transfer over there, draw, right, see if I can sort of find and get this line coming up in the right spot. So again, there's a lot of guesstimation here. I'm not trying to draw this as if it was in a 3D program. I'm really just trying to make sure that we get the initial part of this a little bit away. And this is where, again, you know, you got to play around with it and sort of understand, like, oh, what shape do I want to get? How do I want this to kind of function? So again, I feel like probably there's a little bit less of that horn coming off. So probably what we're going to see here is just that sphere. So I'm still going to try and mass these out. Again, just massing being kind of sketching / drawing, and I'm going to try and line them up. So we can just think about these as being two balls floating in space, and probably what I'm going to see of this far one is just the horn tucking over there. What I'm going to see here is this horn coming over here, something like that. Now again, do we see this one over here? Well, we can kind of track it and say, oh no, we don't. You know, look, you might, if you really wanted to, you could kind of see it. a little bit. I've got center of the face here. This is going to allow me to put in her kind of widow's peak slash center of where the hairline goes there. It's going to be a little bit above the head, but not much. It's really slicked down quite a bit. And the hair comes back and creates these other shapes. Now, we're also going to put in some earrings. And it's good to be able to visualize how far out these earrings go and to try and position them. So this is where, again, just constantly using constructive anatomy, transferring lines, like how far down does it go. All of these things will help to get things looking symmetrical, and that really is the goal. Okay, what else do we have here? Let's just take this basic construction and see if we can add some finesse to it, right? So this is a good start. Most of these things are blocked in. I feel like if I was to add detail to this, I'm not going to run into major problems now. And this, again, is the major goal for most constructive anatomy. Get to this point, and now we can start to finesse it because we've got all our center line, we've got all our lines. I kind of have a good idea where it should go. Just a matter of putting in that detail. All right, to do that detail, I have a slightly sharpened pencil, and I'm going to do what I normally do, which is take back some of this with the kneadable eraser. And I'm also going to see if there's anywhere where I've really made a mistake, or there's way too much construction that I know is going to mess things up. I'm just going to reduce its emphasis. Now, I'm not aiming here to do a fully polished drawing. I want you to be able to see the construction lines here. I want you to be able to understand what's going on, so this will still be sketchy, but again, hopefully now we can get a little bit more space to add detail. So I'm going to rough in and think about this eye patch, just so I know it's there, just so I'm not forgetting that it needs to go here. Putting in these lines. Yeah, cool. All right. Now, secondly, what I really want to do is try and nail these features. So the character has, again, depends which sort of version of it, but character has a little bit of sort of a hooked nose in some of the drawings that I liked. And what I probably did is took that away from the character. Because again, these little things can be hard to draw when you get into it. But if we look at, all right, sort of this drawing, she has a little bit of that nose that goes down there. Again, maybe not as much as this, hard to say exactly, but yeah, certainly not like a pointy nose. Now, the character also has these eyes that are pretty kind of closed, right? She has this kind of Clint Eastwood-esque squint, which I think is like a major sort of part of her character. So again, understanding where the eye is sort of going to go. Like if I was to sort of draw the eye open, it would be around here. But what I'm mostly doing is thinking about how that eye is going to look. And we also have, again, in a lot of it, it's like almost closed, right? Sort of like that, but with a fairly high arched eyebrow. So again, these are things I can refine. I can sort of see how that works. Then I can go in there, tweak these finish lines. It's not necessarily the finish, it's just the beginning. And that's also something that's important to understand. You don't have to necessarily do these Loomis constructions or any of this stuff in a really sort of technical way. You can certainly do it in a much more sketchy way, because either way, it's going to be able to give you the added structure to your process of drawing characters, right? It's going to give you that extra little bit of solidarity. See if I can get that arcing round a little bit more. Now, if I was just drawing a small character like this in a comic book, I probably wouldn't finesse around that stuff too much. You know, once we get the basics there, it's kind of done. But, you know, if it was a bigger, you know, panel where I can really see the character's face, the expression is super important, then that's when I'm going to finesse all these bits and pieces, see if I can add and plus the expression. So really trying to think about this lip protruding forward, because that's like a major part of the character. All right, and this lip kind of coming down. All right, so the lip is kind of coming down there. And then doing some more construction that may or may not make it into the finished drawing, but we obviously need to think about these shapes below the character's lip. And this is where what I've often found is, you know, if I add too much of this stuff, it kind of ends up, yeah, making this drawing really stiff, because we got all these sort of structural lines. But if we put all these things here and then we just focus on the finished lines, the finished product, then what I find is that often at the end it all comes together. And this is a big part of drawing professionally, figuring out how to, you know, work your process. But yeah, you know, typically I'll be drawing characters for a comic book or something like that, and you know, I'm sort of doing all the right things, but it's only when we get right to the end and I kind of put the color in and all the effects and stuff like that, that it all comes together and I'm like, oh, that does actually look like the character. So it can be really challenging to get all these bits and pieces right. So I think what's happening here is, yeah, I feel like this top lip is meant to be a lot bigger to match the character. And this bottom one is meant to tuck in a lot more. So as normal with these demos, I'm doing stuff that's not necessarily fully in line with my style. I would normally be trying to find a clean line set of lines here, you know, not necessarily fussing around with, you know, shading, but it's always important to appreciate what the medium is doing for you. So, you know, if the medium pencil allows me to put in some marks, right, I'll often do that, because why not? But if I'm drawing this to be quote unquote inked, that's going to be a different set of lines altogether. And as I said, often the construction is something where you really have to practice it many times to make sure that you know that what you're actually doing and the lines you're putting down are gonna pay off, right? They're actually going to get you where you want. It's very easy with a lot of these methods, like the Loomis method, to be practicing it and then not really understand how it should fit into your workflow or process. And that's what I found many times early on, is that, you know, I'd be practicing doing it with just, you know, standard humans and it would sort of work. But when I then try and create a finished character, it's really hard to tell what the character is going to feel like, right? Like what the character is going to emote, how they're gonna feel, essentially, because I've got all these silly lines everywhere. And yeah, that can be a real challenge to just figure out how to conceptually put these ideas into your process so that you know, oh yeah, look, I'm just doing the construction. I'm just trying to really make sure that, you know, there's some solidarity here. But at some point you need to focus on character and really, you know, get that part of it sorted. And then you have to really understand that, you know, the character doesn't come along until you put in your finished lines, your finished color, your finished everything, right? That's when it all sort of comes together. So important to know when to think about these things. Because when I'm just blocking it in and thinking about proportion and character, you know, and like where these things should be, it's very easy for me to get worried because, again, you know, I'm putting the proportions in right. The character doesn't look necessarily like the character should. And that's because, you know, proportion from an anatomical standpoint, how high your nose up is, you know, how wide your eyes are versus this thing, you know, they're not real. That's not drawing. That's just proportion. So we shouldn't sort of expect it to, you know, shouldn't expect it to be drawing and look good. So I typically have a few different stages that I'll do for this where I'm going to work on structure and then drawing, and then structure and then drawing, etc., etc. And again, you know, this is a demo, so we're never going to get to, you know, some point where this is looking, you know, really, really amazing, because mostly I've been thinking about structure, and that's also something that is often very frustrating. So what I suggest if you're, you know, trying to add more structure, you know, the Loomis method, Riley method, whatever it is that you're kind of using to try and add more structure to your drawings, you know, yeah, really, really think about how it integrates with your process, right? That's going to be the key to making it work. You don't necessarily have to do it in this technical way. You know, you can be very sort of sketchy. And maybe I'll do a quick little demo right at the end to kind of underline that point, because probably at this stage you're sort of getting, right, like where this is going, right? There's not much point in me refining or finessing this, right? So like, yep, we get it. That's kind of how I do this thing. But yeah, it doesn't necessarily need to be this thing where, you know, we're always being tight. So let's do a few sort of rougher ones, and I'll just try and underline that point because I think it's a really important point to make. So again, if we're just kind of sketching, again, what I'm going to try and do is, yeah, just exactly the same set of things. Define dimensionality. But you can also find a lot of these markers just through understanding basic proportion, and you don't necessarily need to measure everything as much as you might want. You can build the drawing, right? It can be sort of sketchier. But because I have the base there, and again, I sort of know there's that sphere under there, I know where my lines are in my head, it's a lot easier for me to then go in and think about this, right? I don't always even need to put in lines. I can just sketch around, right? And I know that, yeah, that lip needs to be up there. I'm still going to put in the center line. Why? Because it helps. Now, if you're just sketching around, right, trying to block things in for concept art, comics, whatever, you know, doing fan art, again, often what I find is this is the kind of level of sketchiness that I'm wanting for that initial block in, right, for that initial sort of sketch, right? We're doing that preliminary roughing in. Now I'm still going to use the Loomis method for this. I'm still going to use the basic principles here. And because I've got that now, right, because I've got that understanding of where, right, like where that stuff is, it's a lot easier for me to true it up. And that really is also a really important part of this whole thing, right, is that, you know, you can sketch around, right, we can be messy, but because it's based on something, I know that, you know, if I need to, I can go through with it. I can follow through. I can true it up. I know where all these things are meant to be. I can be loose. I can be gestural, right? Again, same thing. We want to draw it from above. All right, I'm going to find that center, put the line down. All right, find the brow. All right, I've got the top. All right, I've got the between the eyes. I'm going to define some dimensionality here just to help me. I've got the nose. All right, I've got some cheekbones. Let's go down here. Right, I know I'm going to go in there. Got the eye patch. Right, just sketching around. And yeah, this is the same stuff. So again, pretty rough. But it's mostly these abstract marks that I need to put in. Oh, line down there, line here. Right, got my sort of ears. And again, you know, this is a process, right? This is something that takes time. So we've got this stage of it. I've got center line here. Boom, boom. And you know, as I need, I can either just leave it super rough like this. I can refine. Again, it's a little bit tricky because can't see exactly what her eyes are doing. And yeah, you know, just doing little sort of gestural sketches. This is not necessarily going to be 100%, but we can chew it up because I know I've got my center line. Right, I've got where. Well, let's think about where that shoulder, torso is going to be if I'm doing this. So again, you know, this would need a lot of refinement. I'm going to need to go in here, right, really figure out like, oh, okay, where are all these things? But you know, this sketch process is going to work. And again, I can refine it. Okay, so as I normally say when I'm drawing this Ara character, the horns are not necessarily something I think is well designed. They tend to be a little bit amorphous, a little bit sort of tricksy to draw, and I often ran into trouble when I was drawing the comic. It's something that I would change if I was to do the redesign. So what I'm going to do here is kind of show you how I would maybe sort of model my way through a drawing like this, and again, do exactly what I was just saying. Take it from a sketchy, you know, sort of mess to something that has a little bit more solidarity. And again, how we might, you know, do some redrawing, but think about the principles and the structure that underlie it. So that's the basic idea here. Again, there's no real reason to start or finish a drawing any particular way, but this is a good example here where I'm trying to figure this one out, where probably what I should have done is start with a little bit more structure in the beginning, and that would have saved a little bit more work at the end. But it's important to understand that character and emotion is the key thing that we're trying to get here. And often that initial sketch and that gesture that might not necessarily be the perfect structural beginning might be a good beginning for gesture and character and emotion, which is, again, as I said, the whole point. So you can kind of always understand that if you get the idea of where all these proportions should go and you understand the principles of constructive anatomy, that it's possible to kind of save a drawing and keep fiddling, but again, the big difference that I often see is that previously, before I got good at construction drawing, I would just kind of keep redrawing, and you know, things wouldn't necessarily get better. The more I got better at construction drawing, understanding the fundamentals, this redrawing process became a little bit more constructive, you know, pun intended. And again, that has helped me a huge amount. But again, just understand, I'm not perfect either. I always sort of think my way through these things. Some of the times the drawings I do suck in the beginning, but it's the foundation that allows me to, you know, persist in a confident way and not freak out. All right, that's probably enough of me noodling, and you get the idea. So hopefully this one was interesting. Again, the key takeaways here are that if we think about the Loomis method as a starting point, but also something that we can use to back up our craft, if you kind of start with the general idea here, and you have principles and understandings that are linked to constructive anatomy and construction drawing, it means that, and again, you can start loose, you can with a lot of character, and then you can try and true it up. Or you can start kind of very static, and then you can, hopefully add character, as long as you kind of understand how all these ideas of proportion, construction, perspective, etc. combine, which again is pretty well explained in Andrew Loomis's Drawing the Head and Hands and his other books. Then again, I think it gives you a really good framework to have fun and again, have a good solid structural framework and foundation to build upon. And again, it's the kind of ideas that I use all day, every day in my drawing that have helped me to, again, control all these proportions and get out of trouble like this. Anyway, that's all I got for this one. Hopefully this was useful. Let me know in the comments below if you've got any ideas or suggestions. Again, I thought it might be fun to try and do some orcs and other sort of typical fantasy things here that might, again, be able to expand upon these ideas. So let me know if that's interesting. Other than that, I'll catch you around. Happy drawing.